Are you just saying that men are insecure?
I'm saying men are trash, so...
Because that is completely correct.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
And we're on our second episode, and we'd like to thank so many people for the success of our episode 1 launch. It was pretty overwhelming. It was really fun. I cried.
You're just expecting like 60 people.
Yeah.
You didn't expect like 300.
Yeah, 300 views. So we'd like to thank a few people first. Like first is Jill Icardo, who made our cute podcast photo. I really like how it turned out. It's a balance of professional and fun.
Just like us. Am
Yeah.
I right?
It had cute little drawings of us. And I think that was adorable. Second, we'd also like to thank Jill Sandigan. She was our social media manager. She convinced us to make a Twitter. We were hesitant at first, but obviously she was right. So you're right, Jill. Thank you. And of course, we'd like to thank all our supporters and followers. It really means a lot that people are actually listening to this nerdy project of ours.
You're a community of nerds, and I love you all.
So for today, we're really motivated to do a lot. We've been researching, we've been reading up, we've been asking people what they wanted to hear. So this episode is about social movements. And we'd like to tackle it because it's a rather broad issue, but also an issue that's very relevant in debate. So it's a popular debate topic. Almost every tournament you join will have a sort of social movement-related motion. Either it's feminism or the LGBT movement or some
environmentalists.
Environmentalists or any racial group. And that's something we'd want to discuss because there's a lot to cover and a lot of useful concepts that you could use for yourself. And I also think this is one of the more fun topics. There's so many different concepts and theories, and like there's so much material out there that you could just use, and they're fun to read up on. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some concepts, some basic arguments, and if we have time, either in this episode or maybe the next episode, we're going to try prepping a motion in relation to social movements. So,
the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves what even is a social movement. And the general definition is that it's a network of people that tries to do collective action for a specific purpose. But social movements have many different classifications, and you can classify them based on the type of changes that they want, whether it's just small changes or big changes, if they're reformist or radical, if they're violent or non-violent. And the thing is, in debates, you usually talk about liberal or progressive movements. We call those innovation movements. But there are also conservative movements, and they're all equally valid. So the thing here is, movements are not in black and white. They exist on like a spectra, multiple spectra. So there are movements that are radical but are peaceful. There are also reform movements that are violent. There are also movements that try to focus on changing individual lifestyles and behaviors. There are other movements that focus on
like groups, bigger amount of people. And basically, it's important for you as a debater when the motion comes out to sort of create for yourself a definition of what kind of movement is this. And that's important for your framing. You want to talk about a bunch of different contexts, because it really does give life to the arguments and does give life to whatever debate you want to end up having. The second way you end up defining, or this is what I read up, and it's also very interesting, is to see movements as a process. And the reason that's important, so you know the weaknesses and strength of the movement based on what part of the process they exist on now. So there are 3 parts to this and 3 steps for a movement to become successful. The first would be the identification phase. And the identification phase is usually where you find out who are the people affected. Is there a common problem? Is there a common solution? And when you find all these different things out, that's when you can claim that a movement exists. That it has to, in a way, have a form of unity for it to be coherent and for it to actually be effective in achieving anything. Step 2, you don't just have a movement exist for existence sake. They have to exist for a reason. And proliferation is often sparked by instances. For example, what was that one example?
Black Lives Matter, right?
Like Black Lives Matter was created because of the death of Trayvon Martin. Yeah. And it sparked a movement altogether. But it doesn't always have to be one big instance that creates a movement. Sometimes it's very gradual, like the #MeToo. It was created gradually through trending, through people making their own experiences known online. And then eventually it became a full-blown movement on its own. So basically, the point of this second step is that there needs to be a reason why there's spotlight on that movement in the first place, and that's either a big, momentous instance or a gradual method before that takes place. And the third and last step for a movement in this process theory is the idea of mobilization. So now that you know who you are, now you have a rallying point, you oftentimes try to make stuff happen. So either you gather resources, you start lobbying to Congress, you start trying to make changes either to the individual, like the environmentalist movement, encouraging others to go vegan, or through bigger, more drastic changes like wanting the law to be overturned or wanting revolutions to take place. So it's important to see movements as a process as well, because it gives you an idea of what your movement needs.
I also think that from your explanation, an interesting thing that you can get from it is the process entails identification and sort of a definition of what the movement is first before actions start happening. And I think that's an interesting perspective to take, especially in the context of very fractured movements with sort of a shaky foundation of what constitutes the movement to begin with. Like, if the identity of the movement is fractured, if the method of proliferation is fractured, then the actions are also fractured. Like, there's a huge variance in the types of actions that particular movements make.
And that's why you have a lot of motions that target specific parts of the process. So sometimes there are motions about, are transgenders, should they be part of the LGBT movement or should they be part of the feminist movement? That's an issue of identification. Or for example, should this particular instance be used as a rallying point for a movement? That's an issue of proliferation. And there's a lot of motions, like endless amount of motions about the strategies movements can take, and that's often tackling the third step of this theory, which is the mobilization. So it's really a thick way to analyze movements, and I also think it's a very clever way to do it, because I think people often forget to view movements in this light. Oftentimes they just default to who they are, what they do, what they want to achieve. Seeing it as a process gives you a really good extension if you have nothing else to talk about.
A third way we can look at it is that social movements are performances, and indeed a lot of scholars have come out and said that social movements aren't really just groups of people, they're more of performers, and this means that when they perform, they convey messages to an audience. This way of looking at it emphasizes that social movements are not just...
They don't just exist.
They don't just exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
They're relational in nature. You need to focus on the audience as well. And what's interesting here is that the audience, to a large extent, is also curated and created by the movement itself. So, for example, movements tend to look at a particular segment of the population and decide that that is their target audience.
Yeah.
And if you're not in that target audience and then you disagree with it, it's likely that they just won't care or they're gonna dismiss you. So this is partly the reason why there are so many accusations against social movements saying that they're just echo chambers, where if you disagree at a pro-Trump rally, you're going to get kicked off the venue, etc. And to look at how institutions shape that audience. Because it's not just the social movement that decides who the audience is, it's also other institutions that compete for it. Like, the state does it because it is the state that gives you the permit to rally. It's also the ruling class that creates policies that reward or regulate or even repress performance of social movements.
When you know that dynamic and you know that there's so many different actors trying to appeal to so many different groups in the spectrum, that's where you get the argument about appealing to the moderates. Like, every movement's goal is to get strength in numbers, and oftentimes it's the moderates or people who don't have any strong stances yet that they try to appeal to the most. And that's why they create a sort of image for themselves. As Kyle said, either kick people out of the rally to give a sense of unity and strength, or
Yes.
what I also read up on is the idea of an injustice frame, that movements have a tendency to make themselves look vulnerable so that people empathize with them more or are more likely to fight for their causes. And we see all movements use this. Like, the feminist movement highlights the patriarchy and the oppressions that they end up facing with it. But it's not always effective. An injustice frame can be abused, and when it's abused, it makes the movement in a way look irrational. Not to say that movement themselves are irrational, but they end up framing themselves accidentally in that way. The best example of this would be PETA, animal rights group, that has a lot of very exaggerated ways to try to appeal to the audience. So they'll equate the shaving of a sheep to a rape of a woman. And sure, they're doing that because they want to gain empathy. But because they go overboard, it becomes less effective. And the injustice frame doesn't do them any justice at the end of the day.
There's also, since we're talking about animal rights, there's also another interesting example that's related to animal rights. I just forget the name of the social movement, but at first they were appealing to restaurant owners, trying to convince restaurant owners to pull out foie gras in their menus, because in order to make it, you have to force feed a duck until its liver swells, and then that's what you use to make foie gras.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's kind of creepy. I'm never eating that again.
No, exactly. It's really inhumane.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why they wanted to make restaurants pull it out the menu.
It's not like the equivalent of pinikpikan in the Philippines. You know that. They get chicken, they tie it up.
They beat it up.
They beat it up so that the blood ends up clotting, and apparently it tastes a lot better.
Yes, is it something like that? It's very abusive. The original target audience was the restaurant owners, but there are some restaurants that actually did pull out foie gras in the menu, so it was working at first. But when some restaurant owners said, no, we can do whatever we like, so many other restaurant owners followed suit, and then they put back their foie gras in the menu. So the movement said, oh, it's time to change the audience. You have to expand who the audience is. So instead of the restaurant owners, they shifted to the general public.
The consumers.
The consumers.
Yeah.
So I think a way that you can argue using this frame is that perhaps it's not working because you're not catering to the right audience.
Yeah. So either you're abusing the narrative, not doing the narrative correct, or you're just targeting the wrong people altogether. There are other ways to define movements as well that are pretty interesting. You can define movements as subject to change. So as besides just seeing them as a process, in a similar light, you can see them as an evolving group of people as well. Like, they also grow up, they also change in their strategies, they also evolve in terms of what they want and what they want to achieve. The feminist movement at first, and that's why we have so many waves, they had the first wave, which was just the wanting the right to vote, and then eventually they want equality, and now it's empowerment. So you can see them as gradually changing. They're not dogmatic entities that just stay put. Or the movements that are dogmatic don't do the best in society.
I actually disagree. Yeah, I actually think that most movements to some extent are dogmatic. Like, they have some non-negotiable values.
Now, of course, they have the foundations that they can change. But their strategy, perhaps, their audience, their targets, end up having to evolve, or else they won't succeed.
Yeah, but there are debates about whether or not it should evolve in this particular way, or should we retain the dogma that we've had in the past? So I think in those types of debates, you need to take a look at like a balance. So should you evolve in this particular direction if it comes at the expense of some dogma that might be crucial or inherent to the principled foundations of your movement?
And I guess there's so many debates about that as well. Like choice feminism, for example,
exactly.
It became a big issue because as much as it is empowerment, it goes against the idea of quote-unquote protecting certain women from particular choices that might be harmful for them, like prostitution, etc.
Actually, this dogma versus evolution thing, it is probably the reason why there are so many splits in movements. So there's a lot of study about the process of movements splitting from one another. So an example would be in Ireland, you had the Irish republicanism movement, which started as just like regular republicanism, but you had a bunch of splinter groups. They're essentially the same in ideology with key variations. Like, there's a separate republicanism movement for women, because they felt like the original movement was too dogmatic and how they treat women just like to be counted or whatever. And there was also another splinter movement for the youth. So there are so many different factors that contribute to it. There's also like geography, location, the time when the recruits were made, for example, or the time that those members joined the movement. Those things contribute because those things change the way they approach dogma versus the evolution of those movements.
And I guess there's always a debate about whether it's a good thing or not. You're going to encounter debates about those almost all the time.
I think we can talk about the Philippine left here for a little bit. Because there's this tendency for a large section of the Philippine left to be very dogmatic to the point where some moderates feel that it's quite exclusionary.
Yes.
For example, judging others because of traditionally bourgeois
views.
Instead of focusing on education, for instance, they choose to focus on the dogma that they already had, and they sometimes refuse to engage. But to be fair, even on the right, you have the same type of dogma. So if you want to look at the polarization that happens in social movements today, maybe a cause of that would be movements are increasingly less likely to give up their dogma in order to change to meet in the middle.
But it's not just current that we can see issues with the Philippine left. Did you know that Anakbayan and Akbayan were split up because of dogmatic differences? They were both part of the Philippine left
Yes.
initially, right? And then they decided one wanted the more radical route, one wanted to integrate itself with government. And that's why we see such a huge clash even within the same side of the spectrum. Whether that's effective or not is, again, up for debate. It's debatable. Woo. Probably we'll tackle that in some other more specific episode about Philippine politics, which I'm pretty sure we're going to eventually have to tackle anyway. The last way to identify a social movement would be to look at its diversity of acts.
Yeah, there's an internal diversity of acts here. Like, as you said, Akbayan and Akbayan used to be in the same social movement, and then they split from one another because of ideological differences, but they also split because of differences in the actions that they recommend take. So before the split happens, there's usually an internal diversity of how they go about getting their goals. So many social movements, you have people on the streets, but there are just as many or even more people who are just on Twitter who are trying to spread awareness on social media. Lots of people call them out and say that they're just armchair revolutionaries.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to look at here is that any social change is multifaceted. You need to take a look at a variety of different institutions that your actions might affect. So, for example, you might be rallying, but that might not
Be the most effective
be the
method.
most effective because your target audience is online.
Yeah.
Conversely, you might be doing well for yourself online, but it's just a liberal bubble that you're in on Twitter. Yeah.
But it doesn't always need to be one or the other. Like, both usually coexist. And usually those that coexist are the ones that do the best for themselves. Like hashtag Fridays for Future is a online movement, but it's also a rally. Or hashtag #MeToo is an online movement, but there are legal repercussions that these women are trying to achieve, right? So the diversity of acts, they exist, but they don't need to be black and white as well.
Yes. Best term, I think, for this is heterogeneity. That movements, essentially, you can't generalize them. They're always heterogeneous. And it applies to what we said earlier about how to classify them. It also applies in the types of actions that they make. It also applies to what audiences they curate and what types of changes to their own ideology they're willing to take.
Yeah. So recap, we just ended defining social movement using 5 different ways. Either to look at their classification, second to look at the process, third to look at them as a performance, fourth is to look at their changes and their evolution, and lastly to look at them in terms of their diversity of actions. So that's the conceptual part of this discussion. The next thing we'd want to do is give you samples of arguments that you'd expect to come up in a debate about social movements, or arguments you can use yourself when discussing social movements. And they're often divided into 2 parts. The first being the principle, which focus mostly on values, morals, on the behaviors and attitudes of people within the group or even outside the group. And second is pragmatic, which are mostly about outcomes, mostly about reactions, mostly about the mobilization step, as we mentioned earlier. So under principle, I think there are 3 really good issues or clashes that often come up. The first being the individual versus the collective, or the issue of who is this movement for.
On one hand, the movement was created for the individual in the sense that the only reason why the movement exists is to expand the choices available to individuals. But on the other hand, the movement is also there for the collective in the sense that the purpose of a movement is to inspire collective change and collective action as well. So there are lots of times when there's a tension between the two, when individual members of the movement might disagree with the overall direction of the collective. So the collective might want an individual to come out of the closet, but the closeted individual might be unwilling to do so because of personal reasons, like a closeted gay individual in a conservative Christian household. There are debates on whether or not there is a moral responsibility for the closeted individual to come out, or there are also debates about outing those closeted individuals, whether or not that is justified for the movement to just declare that the closeted individual is in fact gay, even at the expense of the personal liberties of the individual.
Yeah, or for example in feminism, choice feminism, like is it good for a woman to choose to be a prostitute or choose to be a housewife? On one hand, if your focus is the individual, then obviously you'd say yes, if that makes them happy, if that's what makes them empowered. But on the other hand, you can argue that the actions of one person affects how you perceive the whole movement. And that's why you have to be very careful, even as an individual, that it's justified to curb the actions of one if it means that you protect more people in the long run. So it's kind of more utilitarian in nature, the collective approach, and the individual approach is more deontological, right, in that sense. The second clash that I think is also very interesting is the issue of inclusion versus exclusion, or the question of who is the movement anyway. This is closely related to what I said earlier about the first step of the process, which is identification. Often you will have motions about whether or not this particular group of people should be included in the LGBT, or if men should have a say in the feminist movement, if they have a role, if they should be allies, if they should be even listened to, right?
Or I think a good example would be the role of TERFs in the feminist movement. TERFs, TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, whether or not they should be considered part of the greater feminist movement. Because there are lots of people who say that, and I agree with this personally, that TERFs should not be considered part of the feminist movement. Because they have a very dogmatic and conservative view of womanhood, that it's just the sex that you were born with. So the question is, does the movement want to be inclusive to and include the TERFs, or do they want to exclude them in order to maintain the principled consistency that they're more liberal or progressive when it comes to what constitutes a woman, what can women do, who women are?
And it's not even just the TERFs, because I think TERFs is a rather extreme example. But even like pro-life feminists, like there are debates about whether or not they should be
conservative feminists.
Yeah, conservative feminists, whether they should be part of the feminist movement or not, because they go against the perceived inherent value of empowering individual choice, which of course is also debatable. But it's interesting to look at the variety of different actors that may be included or excluded when you're trying to formulate what a movement ends up becoming.
I also think under this idea of inclusion versus exclusion, the most important test that you can use is how inherent that principle is to the movement. So there's this thing that we call necessary exclusion, where because it's just completely different from what the movement wants, you have to necessarily exclude them from the movement. So if you have a feminist movement, you necessarily have to exclude misogynists,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
So, because misogynists and feminism are just inherently incompatible, you necessarily have to exclude them. So, in debates about inclusion versus exclusion, the question is if it is inherently incompatible or irreconcilable to have them there.
The third issue is, personally, it's our favorite. It's internalized oppression versus liberating limits. And these are big words, but in general, they just try to address or ask, what is it that we celebrate when a particular person does an action on behalf of a movement? For example, and I think the most easy to sort of digest is the idea of choosing to be a housewife. So on one hand, you can argue that it's internalized oppression because women, you can argue, just want to be housewives because for the longest time they've been taught that this is empowering. But in reality, it's just the patriarchy trying to convince women that this is really what they want for themselves, when it may be a structural problem or something that was ingrained to them since birth. And we see this even now. There are lots of women who still look down on fellow women, not because of their own values, but because of values that may have been taught to them by a system that's inherently oppressive to them. But on the other hand, you can argue liberating limits, which is saying that my choice to be a housewife is not me being oppressed, but it's me using what the patriarchy wants and turning it into something that is advantageous for me. So I'm using the limitations that people place on me and using that exact limitation to achieve actualization or achieve a sense of self-empowerment.
I love the term liberating limits because it just seems so contradictory or counterintuitive. Like, if something's limiting you, how can it liberate you? But if you are going to be limited or caged either way, at least when it comes to liberating limits, you can use the things that limit you to sort of push yourself towards actualization, even considering your constraints.
Yeah. And sometimes, things are, and this is my personal opinion, it's a personal choice. Sure, the movement prescribes that you work and become a powerful CEO. But is that really valuable if that's not what liberates you as an individual, or if that's not what makes you happy? So again, it goes back and ties back to the individual versus the collective. Like, it may be liberating for you, but it may be seen as internalized oppression to others and towards the whole movement. So these are the three clashes that I think are really interesting to look at when we talk about the principles of a movement. So after that, the next thing you look at is usually the pragmatic stuff. Things that are based on outcomes, things that are based on reactions of other people. And again, rule of threes, there are three different clashes that I think are very, very important to look at. The first would be what happens internally to a movement based on an action. So this is where we have the issue of fragmenting versus unifying. A choice can either bring a movement together or make it end up falling apart if there are internal disagreements. What do you have to add to that, Kyle?
I'm thinking. Yeah, just like what I said earlier about splinter movements or movements that split from the original movement. That's because of a fragmentation that happens because of ideological differences. But I think the conclusion to the fragmentation aspect of the argument is how people react to a fragmented movement. So in general, a fragmented movement is going to have a harder time getting
Support.
political or social capital or support.
Mm.
It's harder for them to gather like critical mass, for instance.
Yeah.
If you take a look at progressives in the Philippines, because we were so fragmented, we had a hard time backing just one presidential candidate in the 2016 elections.
And tada!
So our votes got split between
Grace Po and Mar Rojas.
Grace and Mar.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening was, if you add the votes for Mar and Grace together, it's always going to be more than the votes that Duterte had. But because you're fragmented, Duterte ended up winning.
Yeah. So obviously there is a principle behind this as well, and a principled issue behind this fragmentation. So on one hand, is it justified to compromise certain beliefs if it means being unified? You could look back in the election and think, should Grace Po have given up her own stances and hold principles to give way to Mar Rojas, or vice versa? Should Mar Rojas have given his way up or Grace Po? But again, that's a principle discussion. But if we're looking purely at outcomes, then you could argue, pragmatically speaking, that it should have been done if it means that Duterte doesn't end up in office. That's the first issue. The second issue under pragmatic would be backlash versus birthing pains, or what the initial reaction to a movement will be. Sometimes you can argue that backlash is bad. Perhaps it will rally up meninists against women even further. Maybe they would use it to initially demonize or undermine the choices that these women have. But I would argue, and this is my favorite response to that if a movement really is hated, no matter what they do, they will end up facing backlash anyway. It's a form of birthing pain, or at least that's the term that we in UPDS prefer to use, and a term that I think is becoming rather popular in the debate community. It's birthing pains because you have to go through that hardship in order to gain acceptance. Like, so many things have birthing pains. When they removed the racial segregation in schools, obviously it was hard for the blacks to end up enrolling in traditionally white schools. They had backlash. They were hated on. Perhaps they were bullied or even pushed to have suicidal tendencies. But they had to go through that. It's a birthing pain so that gradually things end up becoming normalized and gradually people start accepting who they are.
Conversely, I think if you really want to run the backlash argument, you have to directly address the notion that it could just be a birthing pain. Like, you have to argue that it's not just something that you feel in the short term. There are almost permanent implications for the backlash that happens in the short term. Like, it almost permanently sets back the movement by a good few decades if things go wrong.
Yeah, which brings us perfectly to the third part of this pragmatic clash, which looks at the long term, which is demonization versus normalization. So you could argue that birthing pains can lead to normalization, as I argued earlier, that eventually it creates a world where these people are viewed as equals. Perhaps it's a world where the movement gets what they want and is empowered by getting what they want. But conversely, as Kyle already prefaced earlier, it could lead to severe demonization, that the movement as a whole is severely discredited, that they won't be able to make any more acts, they won't be able to move forward anymore.
The thing about demonization and normalization is that these types of arguments really require you to look into the psyche of the audience. Like, you inherently look at the audience that demonizes or normalizes these notions.
Mm-hmm.
So, what types of conversations are you going to create because of these acts? How do these actions affect interpersonal relationships between individuals from the movement and people outside the movement or people who are opposing the movement?
Mm-hmm.
So, you can argue, for example, that affirmative action will necessarily lead to demonization because if you look at a quota, for example, a lot of, for instance, men would be opposed to affirmative action in favor of women
Because they end up losing slots.
because they end up losing jobs, for example.
Yeah.
And that leads to, in the long term, this sense of insecurity that women are there to steal our opportunities, even if they don't deserve it. Well, to be fair, they probably do deserve it. Or you can argue on a principled level that women deserve it because it's just reparations for their historical injustices or whatever. But the point here is you need to take a look at the mindset of the audience. Because on the other hand, if you want to look at normalization, a way that I argue it is even if there are haters, they will still have to think about why they're so affected.
Yeah.
There's an internal discourse within the audience member who was like, why am I feeling this particular way? Or they're going to say, oh, that makes sense. So either way, there's a discussion that happens within the moderate.
So that assumes best case though, that a discussion does happen within the audience. But sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, it can just lead to them being insecure. And there's a term for that in sociology and in international relations, but we'll discuss that some other time. It's called hyperinsecurity. The more you demonize a group, or the more that a group ends up feeling like they become violated or vulnerable. Like men, for example, if you have affirmative action, they end up becoming hyper insecure. And the tendency of them would not be to change themselves. They're going to attack back. They're going to hold on to their conservative views even further. So basically, that's it. Right?
So are you just saying that men are insecure?
I'm saying men are trash. So
because that is completely correct.
Yes, thank you. We stand a feminist here on Debatable. So that's the 3 types of issues and clashes that you end up encountering in a pragmatic analysis of social movements. So given that, we hope you were able to learn things. We don't have a lot of time. We already spent quite a long time discussing the concept. So perhaps in the next episode, we're going to try to prep a motion in relation to social movements. So hooray! This one's a 2-parter. We'll see you in the next episode of Debatable. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!